Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Breaking Uneven podcast. We love to talk shop, uncover the beauty of failures, and play a few games. Today, we have with us the founder of Subco Coffee, Rahul Reddy. From the University of Southern California to Warner Brothers to Google to Tata to King's College London to Kroll to Subco, and I've left a lot out there. That's quite the journey, Rahul, and thank you so much for coming here today. To kick us off, let's get to the crux of Subco. So we play our first game, the Twitter Pitch Challenge.
So as you know, Twitter is known for its 280 character limit on every tweet, which sometimes makes it a little difficult to convey your thoughts. It takes around 20 seconds to speak 280 characters. So we want to transfer this challenge to you to explain to us Subco in 20 seconds. We won't make it easy. We want you to also use one emoji and one hashtag in your tweet. Let us know if you have any questions, and then when you're ready, we can get started.
I think this is the hardest interview question I've ever had. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's good to exercise my brain. Okay, one emoji, one hashtag,
Yeah.
right?
Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, I'm going to go with hashtag reimagining, hashtag redesigning the contribution of the subcontinent to the rest of the world through craft. And the emoji I would use is, I'm going to pick three, sorry, not just one. So I'm going to get the coffee cup, a dude in a turban to represent South Asia, and a paintbrush to represent design.
It went over 30, it went over like, yeah, 20 seconds, around 30 seconds. But bonus points for using multiple emojis, I think.
Yeah, come on, I tripled your emoji allocation, so there you go.
Yes, definitely.
But something really interesting from that tweet that you just shared with us. There was no mention of the word coffee or Subco in
Yeah,
there.
I thought of the same thing.
What?
So yeah, I guess thanks Anuj, for noticing. That was fairly I guess no pun intended for this podcast, but by design. So I the thing is that a lot of times I get asked this question around what essentially people try to kind of seem to try to articulate to me the notion that why does Subco feel different, right? And I guess I can't answer that because I guess I'm one of its principal architects, so it's difficult to kind of explain the foundational elements in enough detail to kind of convey that. But what I would say for sure is that it's always started off as a mission-oriented brand that did not need to necessarily be. It turned out that my passions were coffee and bread, but the idea that is Subco could apply to a lot of different things, a lot of different industries, a lot of different craft processes. So I'd say it was sort of by design that I created an extensible understanding of what this redefinition and redesigning of the subcontinent from a global viewer's point of view would look like, feel like, and how it would be touched sensorially, how your soul would be touched in some capacity through things like type and linguistic diversity, and how all of that ties into really high quality agricultural produce that was being finished in this kind of design driven manner for people. And that's sort of why I think Subco hopefully speaks to people in a way that transcends the products that we create.
Wow, that's absolutely. It's so much. There's so much more to that sentiment than one would, assume there to be. I think we'll get into that a lot more after our second challenge. So let's get into the second challenge, which is it's called Two Lies, One Truth. And the idea is to understand a little more about your journey with Subco. And so, whether it's challenges or your biggest achievements, the idea is that you give us three statements from which one explains the actual big moment at Subco, and the other two are false statements. and then we have to guess the correct one. Which one is the truth?
Oh wow. Okay, wait. Two lies and a truth, and the truth has to be something regarding Subco, correct? All of
Yes.
them have to be regarding Subco,
All
and
of all of them.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
And we've done our research, so it's not
Is
going to
that
be
your
easy.
research? The next vertical that Subco is planning to tackle as a business will be craft tea. Um, the idea of Subco emanated from a long shower in a bathroom in Goa, um, and the favorite piece of baked good that I believe that I have at Subco is the vegan Mossambi tea cake.
Okay.
Okay. I'm just going to take a stab at this really quick. I think the T one is the truth. And the only reason I say that is because it's you sell it on the website, the craft teas. But John, do you want to take a guess in case that's not it?
Even my first thought was the tea. Um, but yeah, I think yeah, I would stick with the tea. But I think that the second one is not far from the truth. There's like some underlying notion on like where the idea came
Yeah.
from.
Should I
Yes.
reveal?
Yes, let's do the reveal.
Okay, so the answer is number two. It was conceived
Oh,
of in a hot, in a 35-minute sort of shower moment that I was having in Goa, and there was literally actually this like funny. I've never told this story on an interview, so I guess this is the best way to do it. Um, so there was like this, like sometimes your glass will like fog up on the, in a fancy hotel bathroom. That I was there for a work offset. I couldn't have afforded to stay in this place on my own, and like yeah, and then sort of the name, the portmanteau that is the subcontinent, subculture, and the meaning being for everybody in Hindustani languages kind of occurred to me, and I like wrote it on the glass, and it just made sense. So that's sort of the truth. There is I don't know if I'm going to tell you about it today. There is a major new vertical that we are working on, but it is not tea as of yet.
Okay.
okay.
And the
Interesting.
Mossambi tea cake is delicious, but it's funny because I never eat it, and there's this like cult following for the vegan
Yeah.
Mossambi tea cake at Subco, and I don't quite understand it, but it's there, and so it's not. I love it, but it's not my favorite thing.
For me, it's the chocolate banana cake.
That thing's
And I
amazing.
mean,
The gluten-free
that has its own
chocolate
following as
cake.
well.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of my friends that just go and just to pick that up.
Oh, that's funny. Nice.
But to get started, you mentioned that you personally had like a passion for coffee and for bread and things like that. So just how did Subco, I know you said that it started, like the idea came up in a shower, but like, can you take us through your thought process on like how you thought of it and where did that love come from?
Sure. The way that I kind of encapsulate this, guys, and I think I can connect this maybe for your audience as well in a certain light. Um, I've had the sort of distinct privilege of living in a few different countries for most of my life, and to get more granular, I've spent most of my sort of adult life between London and New York, and um, and a bit before that as a student in Los Angeles. And aside from having, I can sort of wax lyrical about my relationship with coffee and bread from a pure kind of consumer product point of view and the nuances and how we create product and why. But the main takeaway, I think, really is that what I realized living in these cities was that it's a two-part piece. Like first, there was a global movement occurring towards hyper traceable, small batch, uh, rotational curation of agricultural products that were presented through a design-led process to the end consumer. That was the first takeaway. The second was that when it came to coffee and baking, and coffee in particular, Um, out of about 25 countries or maybe 23 countries that produce coffee agriculturally in the world, India has actually turned out to be the fifth to seventh largest producer, depending on what research you're looking at. And for a country that is the fifth to sixth largest producer of coffee in the entire globe, I was feeling that it was very odd as to why India was never present in any craft coffee experiential sense, whether it was through a brick and mortar cafe or through a retail product anywhere in the world that I was living. And I found this very odd and very curious. And so, no pun intended, but I thought coffee was super interesting because if you really think about it, it's sort of the only commodity that has achieved cultural. It's sort of a cultural tour de force around the world, whether that's because of its ability to, stimulate through the caffeine and hence spur socialization, or what have you, or the fact that many different more advanced economies around the world have created coffee into a highly specialized and niche sort of understanding of the product. For whatever set of reasons, it's the only edible segment at relative scale that exists, which connects the developing world to the developed world. And the reason why I mention this is coffee, the way you experience specialty coffee anywhere in the world is actually through the lens of the country that the coffee beans you're consuming has come from. And the nuances within that country, the region, the terroir, the traceability. And so I thought for me, as sort of a kid that came from an Indian background and was growing up in the US for the most part, I thought this was fascinating transcendence of the two parts of my life. And so I said, wait, why does India not have a role to play in this? And that's sort of where the passion to kind of create that bridge perhaps one day kind of emanated from. And then, yeah, I did my research and I figured either, I was like very curious about it because I was like, either Indian coffee is sort of just terrible and at the agricultural level, it just never survives. The yield is really bad. The yields question I already answered. There's a lot of coffee. That's not the problem. So either there was some kind of a quality problem, which I discovered over time was not at all entirely true. There was a problem around what's called processing of the coffee, in the sense that there was no incentivization from the consumer level for farmers to invest more in processing coffee better, because there wasn't a premium segmentation for the crop. And so hence there was really a brand and marketing problem and a design problem. And I look at brand, marketing, I mean, all of it hinges back to design at the end of the day. That's what I've understood quite deeply for a long time. I mean, I think obviously now design cannot be in a vacuum, and communication design is everything. But I think in essential terms, there was a problem around the perception and understanding of what Indian coffee could represent in a way that countries like Colombia, Ethiopia, Brazil had kind of mastered in their own right. So I said, look, I can't solve all of the problems of Indian coffee, but maybe I can provide an outlet and an opportunity for both the farm level and the consumer level to feel that India can exist in the global tapestry, and I have to do a lot of re-engineering for that to happen.
That's interesting to see, like, the thought behind it. But I'm also curious to know, like, what was your state of mind at that point? Like, when you realized that there is a difference in terms of like the coffee abroad and here, and you wanted to solve this problem. Were you looking to start something of your own? Were you looking to quit your job? Like, where were you mentally in terms of the process, and how long did it take for you to think of this idea and then execute it? Like, how long was the research process and like things like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, the first thing is typically, you know, those in my position, you know, maybe living in another country at the time. I was living in New York and then in London, and I sort of went back and forth for a bit. But the notion of starting something in coffee would have naturally meant, okay, let me find a good set of farmer relationships and import some coffee and then start a shop, right? And this was the natural recommendation made to me by most people, because in coffee terminology, we are at, like, we're sitting in India, right? So we are at origin. We are in an origin country. Now, the notion of creating a great consumer brand from an origin country, utilizing the origin country's produce, is fairly unheard of. There's a couple of examples of it around the world, but it's immensely difficult because you're kind of having to create the market from scratch domestically. Now, a lot of other players have come into the coffee space that have done a commendable job in creating an appetite for traceable coffee, better cafe experiences, and I think a bunch of them, including brands like Blue Tokai, have really set the groundwork for something like this to ever be attempted or experimented with. So I have a lot of respect for those brands. I think in my case, to answer your question, Janvi, the timelines were sort of, I think concept-wise, I'd say the thing about our story, it's really hard to answer this because usually people are like, oh, you had an idea, and then, oh, you tried to find a business model for it, and then, oh, you found an agency to help you create the brand. And for me, I find all these concepts to be really foreign. Like, for me, it's like all of those things all existed together, and all of it had to find representation in the right manner, and that's where, like, Anirudh came into the picture, and I'd love to kind of speak to you more about that when relevant or in another conversation, but essentially, I can't segment it so easily in my case. I think what I would say though is that from conception in some sense to reality, this took about, I was working in Bombay as a risk consultant in the sort of loosely in the political and economic risk analyst kind of space. And I had decided to leave that job, and I was kind of grappling in the beginning of 2019. And I was grappling with this idea around, do I just go back to the States? Did my experiment with moving to Bombay and living in India and contributing to the South Asian future in some way, did it just kind of flail and peter out? And that was sort of where I was at. But the one thing that kept pulling me back and saying, look, like, I felt most passionate about, that I felt like I could action, was around coffee, and eventually around bread, and that's where Daniel, my partner, came into the picture. But essentially, 2019, let's say Jan-Feb, is when the serious thought process began around, okay, am I really going to dedicate my sort of immediate term life to this project, to this idea? And I decided, I had to convince a bunch of people, including my family, that I wasn't insane to kind of do something and in coffee, and they were like, oh, you're going to start a coffee shop, and I was like, well, there will be a shop, but it's not just a shop. It was quite challenging to explain these things to Desi parents and helping them understand, I mean, brand in general, let alone coffee, and it's like, ye banda US se aaya, abhi chai pila raha hai. Like, I don't, it was very difficult to, sorry for my terrible Hindi, but that's sort of the reception that my ideas initially got. And I'd say from then, it was very rapid, Janvi. For me, the idea and the concept was, I would like to say, incredibly formed. It was like very fully baked for quite a long time, which meant the real problem for me was building the subject matter expertise to execute the products because to execute the products in a way that would genuinely elevate what was available already in the Indian market. And that was really important for me, because obviously it can't be smoke and mirrors. I mean, these things have to coincide, right? So great design, great concept, brand arc, all of that stuff is obviously immensely important, but how does that coincide with a genuine connection with the product that translates, right? So for me, that meant going back to New York City. I literally begged. I used to work at Google for some time, and I had some contacts back then in New York who, basically the funny story is Google had one of the coolest coffee shops in the city in its office in New York, right? So when I was working there, and it's all like free, and it's all very, very Google only kind of thing that is possible. It's not reality, but hey, it was nice while I was there. And so the guy who managed the coffee program at Google in New York became sort of a friend or an acquaintance, and I hit him up years after I left, and I said, hey man, I'm really keen to learn how to roast coffee, because I didn't want to lean on any consultants or anybody else who was already maybe in the domestic market here to kind of say, hey, I have a brand idea, can you roast the coffee for me? Then I label it, then I package it, then someone else comes and helps me open a cafe, and then I say okay for them, and then I put it together and I hope it succeeds. This approach was not feasible for what Subco's mission was. So I had to go learn how to roast coffee, I had to learn how to cup it. I felt like I had an inherent, of course, knowledge base just from my own research for a while. And I felt pretty strongly, more importantly than the technicalities of learning how to roast, which I believed could be learned over a period of time. The bigger question was, did I have the palate and the sensory understanding of coffee to backward engineer products that would actually be innovative and work from the farm level to the consumer? So that's where I challenged myself the most, where I went and did a certification in New York called the Arabica Q Grader, which is essentially like a fancy way of saying that I'm a coffee sommelier. That is a globally certified program, commands a lot of, I guess, respect in the sort of coffee community. Interestingly, it also means that I've been awarded the ability to grade coffee that comes from a farm, such that if I score the coffee higher, that farmer, in theory, can actually charge more money for their crop. And they go by this certified process. So there's a couple of layers to it, but that plus learning how to roast in New York took me about, I probably spent about 4 months in that process. And then from there, I had basically already started a conversation with Daniel before that, and I kind of said, look, if I crack this coffee thing in some way, would you be willing to work with me on this as an entire concept? Daniel, I don't know how much you guys know about him, but basically he has been living in India for about 15 years now. He's originally from Chicago, from the US. And I don't know how to describe Dan except to say that he's a savant. He's a genius. I think I'm certainly biased to a degree, but I do believe that he is one of the world's greatest minds when it comes to bread and viennoiserie. So, and I mean the world. So, I feel like I've done enough research of this space to kind of have some credibility on saying that. And so he specializes in very technically challenging baked goods, which means a lot of times in India, people hear about bakery here, and they think two things. One is Desi Wala bakery, so like, pots and stuff, and which is fine, which makes sense. We are in India. The second is cakes, patisserie, French bakery. And Daniel is neither of those things. Subco is kind of an amalgamation of things, but Daniel's expertise, which I believed was really critical for Subco to achieve its goals, were to kind of showcase sourdough bread and essentially different versions of croissants, which are otherwise termed as viennoiserie, laminated dough, essentially. How could those two things be presented in a wholly new quality standard light, technical prowess, and flavor innovation, which would also become localized and indigenized in several ways. And a great example of that is the Halim quiche, or the espresso stuffed croissant that we utilize our single origin coffee from India to make the cream out of. So that's sort of where me and Daniel kind of came together, and he thought that the sort of mission and the concept was, I guess, worthwhile for him to be a part of. So that brings us to end of 2019. I essentially, maybe September 2019 is when I returned to Bombay. To fast forward, I had identified this decrepit house in the middle of nowhere in the bylanes of Bandra, and I guess this is the other challenge, is I had to convince everybody in my life that this was not the worst idea ever, was to put this coffee roastery and bakery in this random place that nobody could ever find. And genuinely, if you've been to Subco in Chapel Road, we call it Mary Lodge because that's the name that the space has had since 1925. There's no parking, there's hardly any space to walk there, there's no drop-off point, essentially it almost feels like we don't want you to find it, right? And I guess that's what I felt would be needed. I almost created a sense of self-selection to say people that are ready for this pilgrimage for an elevated understanding of coffee and bread might make the effort. And the chances of that were pretty low. Like, I thought this was most likely going to fail, but I was either going to do it this way or Subco wouldn't be done at all.
My God, you've just stolen our next question, which was
Sorry.
about no, but the question was about the location of the first Subco, and what I mean, I've been to it, at least 100 times, and I find it really charming, right? It does it adds a lot to the charm of the place, and I know people that make that effort to go there, and yeah, I guess the idea, the question was, that now that you've got these other locations, you've got the Craftery in Baikala, and then obviously a bunch of different pop-up like stalls. Um, is that charm still there? Because for me, if I go to Subco, I want to go to that Chapel Road one. I don't want to go to any of the others, right? So how's that image as of today?
Yeah, it's a good question, Anuj. I think there's a couple of layers to it. The first is that I would agree with you. I mean, my favorite space in which we do anything probably always will be the Chapel Road space. So I don't think there's any need to be shy about that. I think there is a truly unique character that space brought to the forefront. And I mean, I hope that in a future space we can one up Mary Lodge somehow. But I do believe very deeply in the heart and soul of what that space has helped us do. That being said, if you really break down our current spaces, let me tell you a bit about the philosophy around space, spatial design, the understanding of why we've done what we've done from the point of view of physical brick and mortar we only actually have right now two real flagship stores, right, or cafes, experience centers, whatever you want to call them. Mary Lodge, which you described in Bandra, and the Craftery, which is our roasting and sort of centralized bread production facility in the neighborhood of Baikala West in Bombay. And if you really think about that space, it was actually it was quite a risky decision in many ways, and there was a concept attached to it. So the Craftery, well, the fact that it has a name, I guess, in itself tells you something. But essentially, we converted what was an old printing press in this printing area called Jack Printers in Baikala. And Baikala was chosen very, very specifically for a few reasons. The first is that, so it's not happenstance that we just have a roastery in Baikala, right? So that's the first thing I wanted to kind of explain. There's one practical reason, which was very difficult to kind of nail down because there aren't a lot of spaces that can provide for the infrastructure we need at an affordable cost that are essentially central geographically to both the suburbs and the south of Bombay. If you really look at the map, you triangulate to Baikala. So there was one practical reason for that. The second is that if we were to open a space, if we were to centralize our production, which we needed to do from a product point of view, essentially what I mean by centralized production is have a larger facility to roast coffee in, to package, and to bake bread and croissants in their base form, and then we would do finishing bakes and flavor piping and everything else like fresh in each of the spaces you find us in. Right, that was sort of the concept. And again, the distance is only 30 minutes, so it's not like freshness is being lost in translation from this facility. So basically, that was the overall premise. Now, I was drawn by two things in the Craftery. One is the fact that it does have a historical, a kind of an identity before what it is today, which was used for printing and being the kind of design-driven brand experience that we are. I thought that was quite apt. And the second piece is that Baikala as an area and as a neighborhood, I believed for quite a while was sort of the closest thing to like an unearthed Brooklyn that Bombay maybe had. And I sort of said, okay, can we be a part of rejuvenation in a neighborhood that actually has a very rich history by the Mazgaon docks, with a lot of commerce that was flowing through this area. It's gone through many waves of sort of ins and outs of sort of development. There were, of course, a couple of businesses here before us. There was the Magazine Street Kitchen that was there. The Bombay Sweet Shop had come up in this neighborhood too. And I said, look, if we're going to be trying to kind of create a community of artisans and craftspeople, Byculla seems like a place which allows us to not only have a bit more space at a sort of affordable tick, but also allows us to maybe one day build a community of small businesses and of very, let's say, creatively driven sort of entrepreneurs and people that could actually rejuvenate this neighborhood into the future. So that's sort of that.
Wow. And, you know, I think I totally agree. It is quite important to choose the space, not only from a functional perspective, but also from a brand perspective. But then, and as you said, you've got two main locations, which is Chapel Road and now
Yes.
Byculla. So
And then
when it comes,
sorry, I didn't answer the full extent of the question. That's true. Okay. So I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. So to just finish there, Anuj, after those two stores, what we've done is essentially we've very, very carefully curated a host of there's 5 right now, which are, as you said, they're kind of like fixed pop-ups, you could say, which we call Subco Mini, which is a condensed kind of experiential layer to brand aligned partners that we believe adds value to the experience of people that are broadly of a very similar mindset in their consumption of other products to us in coffee and bread. So this was something that occurred to me where I said the idea was never foot traffic, it was never optimizing placement of the brand, it was never anything like that. It was essentially the following: which brands in the city are doing something that we believe is heavily curated, bespoke in nature, prioritizing oftentimes design thinking, and that's in different segments, right? And sort of what ended up happening was I drilled that down to, of course, there are other spaces that also do great work with who we are not currently partnering with. So it's not to take away from those brands. It's just that what ended up happening was we were approached by the Bombay Shirt Company, who are now an amalgamation of 3 or 4 different fully bespoke, custom tailored brands. And I thought this was very interesting because South Asia has such a strong history of tailoring. And I said, oh, which brand is actually trying to reimagine tailoring for the kind of contemporary population? And this brand sort of really sticks out in that respect. And so we decided to partner with them. Then we decided to partner with Kitab Khana, which is this beautiful antique bookstore, which is really one of a kind in Fort. And they were kind enough to kind of consider us for their space because they wanted to change in their space, and they didn't want like a proper restaurant there anymore. They wanted something that was a bit more light touch, a bit more culturally and brand wise integrated into their overall store. So I thought that was a really interesting opportunity for us to have a bit of Subco experience available to people. And then the other 2 kind of spots right now that we're working with are the Abode Boutique Hotel in Kolaba, which is really close by to the Taj and the Gateway of India. And if you've been there, it's a beautifully designed space with a very clear commitment to kind of how does the contemporary and the old Bombay kind of coalesce from a spatial point of view. So, and then lastly, there's the Quorum Members Club in Lower Parel, which is not typically open to the public. Actually, it's a member space, but again, a lot of the similar principles around which I spoke. So these are the spaces in which we decided that there could be a very curated footprint for Subco without compromising on our ideals, without going into a space of just looking for foot traffic or just trying to expand the business, because I don't believe in that principle at all. And I believe that the only way a brand like Subco can or should scale in any way is to do it in a very painful, meticulously curated sense. And that is the only possible way in which we can do it, because the identity, the mission, it's too inbuilt, it's too overarching. So I think it's safe to say that any spatial pursuits that we have into the future will probably involve things around heritage, will involve things around how the fabric of the urban environment that we are in whether it's in Bombay or elsewhere, play into the Subco mission, and our design thinking and our way of designing spaces, what is most conducive to all of that. I think that's really the effort, and I'm not concerned about how visible, how much foot traffic, where exactly it's placed. I mean, of course, we want to be in having our brand in a location where we believe, you know, folks that might appreciate it do visit from time to time. But I think beyond that, I think I'm not at all concerned, and I think our choices at the Craftery and Mary Lodge prove that. I'm not at all concerned about placing things in a place which is necessarily, you know, most conducive to commercial success.
No, I mean, you know, I agree with the fact that it's a tough choice to not partner with people as much as it is to partner with people, and it requires a lot of patience, right? Like especially with the kind of growth that Subco saw in its first year, in the first 3 months, of course, it's easy to just say yes to all opportunities, but you know, keeping that overarching mission in mind and everything, it's super important. I agree, but you know, I've had the privilege of going to the Subco at Bombay Shirt Company and at the Quorum Club. And it's just a random thought, but one thing that really stood out to me was that y'all didn't have the milk bun there. And then obviously I saw the entire offering and I realized, so it is the entire palette of coffee offering, but a very small selection of the baked goods. So, you know, considering that you even so far on this call, it's been a coffee plus bread brand, is that something that's mainly a logistical issue?
Well, it's a good question. You know, it depends. I think there is a long journey ahead for breads in India. I think we are trying to play the role of, in some sense, it's funny because in one way, I would agree that we're very much a boutique experiential brand. In the other sense, I feel like we're now kind of bestowed with this mission of being like, hey guys, like bread can be a part of your daily consumption pattern, like bread in some way. Now, of course, people have always liked cake in India. People have always liked, I mean, it's not like we're the first people to ever bake anything. That's not what I mean. But what I mean is that to create a frequent consumption of, let's say, something like a croissant, I don't think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there was a cultural relevance for a product of that nature, maybe even a couple of years ago in the same respect. So and neither for something like a sourdough loaf. So I think to answer your question, there is a logistical element to it. It's less that though than because we did centralize our production, we do have the ability now to scale up our baked goods and to have them be more accessible in various parts of the city. We kind of believe that I think the availability of both beans and bread in a wholesale context. I've always been on this on this journey of like refinement with that, because I look at it more as, think about it this way: if you give your beans or your breads to a partner, whoever it might be, who doesn't really know how to take care of them, right? Or doesn't want to, or just feels like, hey, I have a good quality product, I'm just going to throw it at a customer and hopefully they buy it. I think that does a disservice to the craftspeople behind the product, to our brand, and you know, the whole thing. So our approach has been much slow. In fact, it seems very rapid, but like you rightly said, Anuj, like there's been like, I don't know how many no's in the process of saying these 5 yeses, you know? So for us, although it seems like there's been a rapid growth stream, I think it could have gone in a very different direction if I'd kind of just let the products just flood into everywhere. And maybe that would have been a commercially good thing for Subco, but I don't think the mission of Subco would have been retained, and I don't know if we would be, you know, talking today. So I think there isn't as much of a logistical problem as a set of principles that we require when we think about, you know, why to partner with somebody, how to make it happen. Is there training that they're open to with regards to how to brew coffee effectively? Like if you have a coffee at the Quorum, I want it to be identical to the coffee you
Yeah,
have at Mary Lodge to the degree possible. Coffee is always a little variable. Extraction can always go a little bit in and out and a little bit ori.
of course.
It's not a perfect science. It takes immense amounts of concentration and training to get it exactly the same. And that's the fact behind specialty coffee and craft coffee. It is inherently variable. And of course, you need to have a lower margin of error, but which comes through effective roasting, consistency in the roast profiling, great training. But there is variability that's possible, and I think all of us have experienced that at any coffee shop. Like there will be some days where the coffee is a little different, some days where it's not. Hopefully that can get reduced by choosing the right partners to work with.
I think throughout our conversation so far, it's really interesting to see how much thought goes behind like every aspect of what Subco's involved in, whether it's, yeah, like from launch, the thought process to like the locations to your products and everything. What's the most like difficult thing of running Subco or like a coffee and bread company?
I'm not saying this because you guys are the ones I'm talking to, but it's so one, it's design. So I mean, there's a lot of difficult things to be fair, but I would say a combination of very consistent R&D work on the product side, which is very, very intent driven, right? So something like let's say, I don't know, the Sif on the Rocks, which is a beverage that we developed, which is essentially the South Indian filter on the rocks, is what we call it. Essentially, it's kind of a cross between a Vietnamese iced coffee and your typical South Indian wala like filter coffee. So it's not a very complex beverage to create, but we had to create a cultural contextuality for cold coffee in a specialty light. And that was the difficult bit. Creating something like a Halim quiche does not happen just by happenstance, right? There has to be enough codification of what we are trying to achieve with that product. I look at it a lot more like a tech company would look at developing a set of products. I don't look at it as, okay, we'll just, oh, this might be tasty, so let's just release it. Like, it's really, that's maybe 50% of what it is, maybe 60%, but no more than that. I think the rest of it is very concept driven. But the hardest thing, honestly, till date, has been we took a decision after our initial partnership with Anirudh, the Big Fat Minimalist, in creating the brand identity for Subco, where me and Ani were spending several months on kind of crafting this. I decided to go in a very different direction on this particular key point, which was once he handed over the first version of Subco to me, I said, look, Ani, I mean, I can't, you run your own agency and you do your work, and I can't expect you to be working with me and for me forever. So what do I do? And I sat and thought about it, and I said, okay, well, obviously I have to find another agency that kind of tends to that. He was not going to be a full service agency that kind of just tended to things that way. And so I was like, I got to find a good agency. But then I sat down and again, and I thought about it. I was like, what have I learned through this process? I learned that with Ani, I learned that I might understand some visceral things about brand building and about design, and maybe I have more of a creative bent than I realized. So I basically decided, let me test that theory out by essentially establishing the beginnings of what would become, we kind of affectionately refer to as the Designery, which is our own creative studio. So we decided to eschew the idea of going the agency route, and we decided to build everything in-house. So that first started with one graphic design intern named Radhika, who then kind of became sort of a full-time graphic designer on board. And then, Jeff Nelson came on board, who was great on video and photography and music. And that sort of kind of grew and snowballed, and it became copywriting and visual design and graphic and motion and all sorts of stuff. And that has been incredibly challenging to figure out because, as you guys know very well, I mean, that's its own business, that's its own thing in entirety. So navigating, building the business, developing the products, and having such a very, very close relationship with every single creative asset that's ever produced is something that is very challenging, also very rewarding, and I believe it's fundamental to Subco being what it is currently.
Yeah, definitely. I think like nowadays there's so much importance on brand and what you represent and things like that beyond just the products you sell. So it's so important to put together something that people relate with and like be a part of like a community altogether. So in terms of Subco and like everything that you're working on, it started with an idea of like the subcontinent of India and like it being part of a global scale. So would the dream then be to have like either Subco pop-ups or like these cafes in cities that you previously lived, like LA, London, New York, or where does Subco go next?
Oh man, yeah, don't ask me that question. um, I guess the answer is yeah, that's always been a dream. I think we have our work cut out for us if we're going to make that happen. It's not. I've always fashioned Subco very strictly through a global lens from the outset, which means that I have never looked, I've never done like a local market SWOT analysis or like sat there and been like, okay, where exactly do we, I just never operated that way. I said, look, I've sort of had the privilege of experiencing and purchasing from and being a consumer of a certain array of brands around the world. It didn't matter, some of them could be in India, but it didn't matter where they were. The point was, who do I believe are thought leaders in this space? And how do we participate in that conversation with them? And so I don't know how much, I don't know how far along we've come in achieving that level and that standard and that resonance with people, but that's up to you and others to decide. But I think that we're very committed to that, and I think that as and when we feel we've gotten close enough to those ideals, we'll hopefully, and if people keep supporting us the way that they have, which is very critical for us to have any opportunity to do that, I would love the chance to showcase Subco in another city outside of India, and it's a very real aspiration, and I have to figure out how to get there.
I think it's also important to like remember that it's also just in 3 years. I think like when I heard of what Subco does and like where and
it's not
just
been 3 years yet.
yeah.
It's 2.5.
Okay, yeah. So
yeah. It's a little under 3 years.
yeah. So
but to be honest, we look at it operationally. That I look at Subco as having started essentially in August of 2020.
okay.
So in fact, I really look at this as a 2.5 year trajectory, because before that we didn't have a cafe, we had retail beans and nothing else. We didn't have half of our business live. So essentially from March to August, let's say March to July 2020, there was no real Subco as such. I mean, we were just working on survival and that's it. And so yeah, from August to August, 2 years plus a few months.
Yeah, fair. So like I think like initially I was definitely surprised to see how much y'all have done so far in just like 2.5 years as well. So like there's a lot more to come, and it's exciting to see how like Indian brands are venturing out of India into like all the Western markets, and like I'm definitely excited to see like Subco being part of all of these cities.
Well, I hope you're right. I hope we can manage that.
Yeah. So our next challenge is red flags. We're gonna give you 3 situations composed of 2 things that are gonna be great and one that's not so great, so the red flag. We've adapted these for Subco, and then you have to pick which one of these 3 situations you'd rather be in, and like tell us why. There might be some things that you've already achieved, and hopefully, like none of the red flags have happened or will happen. But it's just in order to see what you would rather choose. So the first situation is that Subco's brand is ready and absolutely amazing. To the location has been beautifully designed and ready to open. But the red flag is a national lockdown hits 3 days after launch. Situation 2 is that Subco's merchandise is going through the roof. You win a Coffee of the Year award, but a customer complains of food poisoning after eating the Poli BG. Situation 3 is that Subco is booming across 5 countries. Starbucks approaches you for an acquisition, but your latest campaign is received horribly on social media.
Wow.
They're not all unreal situations. Situation 1 is a real.
Yeah, that's. I guess. I don't know about amazing and all of that. That's subjective in situation one, but I'd say the heart of situation one was real. That actually happened. So that one I'm gonna remove from the list because I mean, interestingly, I've never been able to still answer the question around whether whether I would have had it differently with regards to what happened to us and in terms of us opening and the immense risk that and stress that put on the business and on the brand. And I'll never know the answer. I guess in some way maybe that developed a huge amount of resilience, not only in me personally, but maybe in the entirety of the DNA of everything that we did afterwards. And so maybe that's part of the reason why we've been so stubbornly committed to building Subco in the way that we are trying to build it. So maybe that was a good thing. I don't know, but it was very painful in the moment. So I'm gonna skip that. But between the other two, that's interesting. I guess I'd have to say, I don't know about. This is a very difficult one, guys. You guys are putting me on the spot. I don't know. I can't decide between the next two. I mean, I guess situation three, whether it's Starbucks or somebody else, I guess that's always an interesting conundrum to be faced with, and what would we do and these kind of things. I think it's way too early for us for that, but I think I guess maybe situation three, because I'd like to think that the pros in that situation outweigh what I believe we could hopefully explain to people, given the amount of effort we put in to our design thinking, our content creation, why this particular campaign just fell completely flat, or why we were misaligned or misguided, or why we just didn't hit it. So I think I guess I would take that scenario.
So our thinking behind the three situations. Obviously, situation one is self-explanatory; it's a real situation that happened. But in situation two and three, we want to bring out the idea that situation two, the red flag, is something that's at the heart of Subco, which is the actual coffee, bread, whatever it might be. It's at the heart of the brand. In situation three, again, the red flag, which is the design, the communication that Subco maintains. Again, heart of the brand. But then we also wanted to put out a few bits and pieces to see okay, is merchandising something that's really important to Subco? Or would Subco even...
That's tough, Anuj, because all those red flags are really important.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why I couldn't really choose, but of course, I believe for situation three to occur, situation two would have had to happen,
Yeah.
from the red flag point of view. So, green flag, sorry. So there's my roundabout answer that I would give.
Yeah, I think it's just, whenever we do end up playing red flags, it's a very tough choice for a lot of people, what to let go of and what to pick. And we do try to put in, the kind of, let's say, something really important as a red flag in each situation. So it is a tough one, but I'm glad you explained to us the kind of circle of thinking that brought you to this answer.
Yes, definitely. And I think it's also interesting to see whether you would think Starbucks approaching you for an acquisition, whether that's actually a red flag or a green flag. Even that would be interesting to see. What do you think of a corporate, more traditional coffee company acquiring something that's a little more niche and has an element of experience to it? So I think overall it's interesting to see where founders think how to navigate the red flags and again weighing the pros and cons of which ones they're okay to deal with in order to get the pros.
Exactly.
So we wouldn't be a talk show if we didn't have a rapid fire round. So it's standard rapid fire rules.
Is this coffee meets what's it? Coffee
with Karan.
Is that the
Yeah.
Coffee with Karan but Anuj version? Okay, right.
Alrighty, so standard rapid fire rules. We have about 3 seconds to give a one-word answer, and we'll kick off. So, your feeling when someone adds a lot of sugar to their coffee?
Empathy.
Your favorite coffee configuration?
Like brewing equipment?
Brewing equipment plus how you like to have your coffee then.
Oh, pour over.
Pour over. Okay, awesome. Your favorite Subco location? You already answered this, so we'll skip it. The scrappiest thing.
Do I have to pick between the children? That's the question.
We know the favorite.
The scrappiest thing. Yeah, we know the favorite. The scrappiest thing you've done to build Subco.
Snuck past, can't be one word answer, but snuck past police and PMC officials for months to get to the roastery during the heart of the lockdown, roast coffee, and start to send boxes of coffee out to people in Bangalore.
Wow, that's awesome. I love it. After our conversation, I find the question a little tougher to answer, but one thing you'll never do with Subco.
Wow, that's tough. Interesting. I'm pretty sure I can safely say this. Macarons.
Interesting. Okay. Your favorite coffee that is not Subco?
Ooh, wow. Can it be from anywhere?
Yeah. Anywhere.
Really amazing brand and great coffee called Onyx, Onyx. Please check them out. You guys, all the design nerds that might be watching this will flip out.
All right. Then, what is the weirdest place from where you have worked?
From where I have worked? That's a good question.
If you find it tough to answer, I can venture a guess. Would be your shower in Goa, which was the conception.
That's the one. Let's go with the Goa shower. Yeah, that's the one.
The Goa shower. Alrighty then. Books or podcasts?
Ooh. Is this politically correct since I'm on a podcast?
No, you can.
No, you can go for books.
Oh man, I'm 50-50. Both.
Alright. iPad or notebook?
Ooh, notebook.
Notebook. Alright. Are you a morning person or a night person?
Night.
And finally,
all day.
all day. Fair enough. And finally, your favorite social media?
Ooh. I guess I'd have to say Instagram. Easy answer.
Nice. Awesome. So that concludes the rapid fire segment, bringing us towards the end of our conversation. But just one last thing is that we ask every guest of ours to ask a question for the next guest. So first we'll ask you your question, and then you can ask a question to our next guest. So your question from our previous guest is,
what was your biggest mistake and what would you do differently in building the business?
I don't know. I'm gonna focus on what I would do differently. I don't know how many critical mistakes have been made yet. I'm sure they will happen, but I'd say certainly things that I could have done a lot better. So I think one of them is possibly. I think. Look, I'm a sort of I guess first time entrepreneur. So I think maybe having a bit more literacy on things surrounding licensing, finance, compliance. I think all of these elements were things that I think I was underprepared for in terms of what I was getting into in the beginning, and there was a very harsh learning curve when it came to all of that. And so I think I probably would have spent a bit more time immersing myself and perhaps having a team member on board from the very outset who was much more literate than me in that regard. So probably that, and yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. It's, when you're in the kind of F&B space, it is all that more important. And, the traditional legal system in India is not all that easy to navigate, especially if you've lived your life abroad. It is quite difficult coming back to that.
Yeah, exactly. For me, contextualizing all of that into India was a huge, a huge endeavor. So I think that was the one.
Cool. Awesome then. That brings us, to the end of our episode with you, Rahul. Thank you so much for joining us. It was an absolutely amazing conversation. I think, it was just absolutely great to learn so much about Subco. And, I know Subco really well, but I didn't know half the things that you mentioned to us today. So, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anuj. Shakti. It's a real pleasure and honor, and please keep up the very important mission that Curious has in the Indian context, and also thank you for supporting us in our sort of brand journey to date. So I appreciate that.